all for coming today, and so thank you all for coming today and for sitting in for the first panel. And I'm on to the next panel. It's called When is Architecture? The Affective Lives of the Built Environment. And I'd like to call the panelists on stage, and I will continue giving introduction to each of the panelists as they come in. So the first is Dr. Annapurna Garimala, and she's actually come down from Goa for this, so thank you. Dr. Annapurna Garimala is a Delhi-based designer and art historian. She heads Jackfruit Research and Design, an organization with a specialized portfolio of design, research and curation. Jackfruit's recent curatorial projects include Vernacular in the Contemporary at the Devi Art Foundation, Fate Manu Parekh in Banaras at Art India, and Mutable, Ceramic and Clay Art in India since 1947, possibly one of the first big ceramic exhibition held in India at the Piramal Museum of Art. She is also currently involved in setting up and ideating about the Barefoot College of Craft in Goa with the Serendipity Arts Festival. She has authored innumerable books, I'm not saying all of them. And in 2017, she was awarded the India Today Emerging Curator of the Year Award. Thank you, Annapurna. Next, I'd like to invite Rupali. Rupali Gupte is an architect and urbanist based in Bombay. So another person has come in from Bombay. She is an associate professor at the School of Environment and Architecture, which was also a school she was part of setting up. Her work often crosses disciplinary boundaries, yet focusing on architecture in the built environment, cultural aspects of urban economy and property, tactical practices, housing and urban form. In 2003, she founded Collective Research Initiatives Trust, and in 2013, 10 years later, she founded the School of Environment and Architecture in Bombay. She is also a curator, an architect, an artist, and her current curation work was one of the biggest architectural exhibitions ever held in India at the Jawahar Kala Kendra called Venice Space. She was also involved in the setting up the Shanghai Biennale, and her installation work called Transactional Objects was shown at the 56th Venice Art Biennale. Next, I would like to invite Professor A.G.K. Menon. Professor Menon. Oh, thank you. Okay. Professor A.G.K. Menon is an architect, urban planner and conservation consultant practicing in Delhi for over 40 years. He has been simultaneously teaching in Delhi and in 1990 co-founded the TVB School of Habitat Studies, Delhi, now Architecture School of Indraprastha University. He has been actively involved in urban conservation and in 2004 drafted the Intact Charter for the Conservation of Unprotected Architectural Heritage and Sites in India. In the past, he has been associated with the formulation of the Delhi Master Plan 2021 and as a member of several statutory committees. In addition to his professional consultancy work, he was until recently the convener of Intact's Delhi chapter. Thank you, Professor Menon. Next, I'd like to invite Professor Anuradha Iyer Siddiqui, who has come in from Colombo and New York and many global locations, I would say. She's an architectural historian and a postdoctoral fellow in the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard, and she joins the faculty of Barnard College, Columbia University in July 2018. Her research stems from two book projects, Monuments of Humanitarianism, Architecture and the History of the Dadaab Refugee Camps, and Vocal Instruments, Minute de Silva and an Asian Modern Architecture. She has published widely and received her PhD in the History of Art and Archaeology from the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. She has practiced as an architect in Bangalore and New York. And the last person I'd like to invite is Professor Yasmin Arif, who was also somebody I studied under at the Delhi School of Economics. Professor Yasmin Arif is an associate professor in sociology at the Delhi School of Economics, University of Delhi. Her doctoral work has been about post-war recovery in Beirut and Lebanon. Her recent book, Life Emergent, The Social and the Afterlives of Violence, under the University of Minnesota Press, explores a politics of life across multiple global conditions of mass violence. She's also working on a forthcoming manuscript called The Unusual Urban Cities in Conversation, which compiles all her work across different cities in the world. She has held positions at the University of Minnesota, the Graduate Institute Geneva, CSDS, and the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. She has received the awards of the Mellon Foundation, Ford Foundation, Fulbright Nehru Fellowships, amongst many others. Her research interests are international law, humanitarianism, philosophy, and epistemology. Thank you all for coming today. And I'm not going to introduce Thomas again. Is that right? Okay. So we're going to start this session now, and I'm going to start with a small passage about what we meant by thinking about when is architecture and the affective lives of the built environment. Is architecture the making of a clay pot, a brick, a tile, or is it the making of a kitchen, a spice rack, a parking lot, or is it the making of a playground? Is it the velocity of an overnight built glass facade corporate tower, or is it the simmering slow flame of a refugee colony? When is architecture, I would like to ask again. How does architecture happen in the everyday? In the practices of making, mending, arranging of shelves and lights, of scrounging for leftover blue tarpaulin sheets between sand mafias and bulldozer lobbies? Is architecture located between home loans, air conditioner advertisements, and DDA apartments for the heteronormative life of Indian families, or does it actually emerge in the split-up households of the Hindu Succession Act of 1955? Are houses made of thatch and cement, steel, mud, brick, or are they arranged as a set of windows, book racks, sunlight, or memories? Is architecture about survival, or is it about aspirations? As Aga Shahid Ali, a famous poet, said, rooms are never finished. When do we start actually to stop building, dwelling, and making this life and its built environments? In today's discussion, we aim to approach architecture then as a field, a practice, a way of thinking, working, and making that navigates the terrains of frantic urbanization, vernacular built environments, resource frugality, poverty, bureaucratic forms of design, national assertions, and architectural aspirations. We move from thinking about architecture pedagogies to forms of making, to forms of living. Many of the questions will remain unresolved, and many of the answers hope to answer themselves. So first I'd like to invite Annapurna to start this presentation. The first three presenters will be Annapurna, Rupali, and Professor Menon. And they will talk about their work about setting up new schools and pedagogies on architecture, and all the work that they have done on the ideas of making and how it informs the field of architecture.
Let me begin by saying thank you to Saruva and to many colleagues here, and as well as in the audience, for taking the time to raise the question and start a conversation. So I'm a little confused after the first panel of what to say. So I think I'll just be myself, and if it sets a little bonfire here and a little bonfire there, we're all grown up enough and we'll deal with it. Okay? So, first of all, I am an art historian who trained in art history and architectural history, and I come from a design background, and my PhD was in a field that is not anywhere in your curriculum. It doesn't fall under the heritage category because very often heritage is history without politics. And the kind of work that I did is deeply political because it was about the Vijayanagara Empire and looking at what the act of renovation did to make a place, to make a society, to make craft, to make buildings, to make a landscape, to make a cultural formation. And then after that, I've been kind of continuing that work on late medieval India, or what some would like to call early modern India, and continuing to work with a very global, well, not the word global, I won't use that word because it wasn't used that way then, but a word like international might be useful. So you might hear Anuradha talk about it a little bit in her presentation, but the foundation of MARG, which originally started off as Modern Architects Research Group, and then within a year flipped to also become MARG, the Sanskrit word for path. So this kind of dual existence, kind of transactional relationship between the classical local and the international modern was moving between the two for quite some time. And it was very deeply involved in, let's say, thinking about the formation of India's first post-World War II, after independence art history program. Mulk Raj Anand, the founder of the journal, along with a group of other people, including Manette de Silva, were very keen to think about things like what will happen when New Bombay happens. What are the possibilities there? And when the state of Haryana, where O.P. Jindal is located, I feel very fortunate to have read every single piece of paper in the Mulk Raj Anand archive, including the letters from the Chief Minister of Haryana when it was formed, to say, we need a MARG issue dedicated to Haryana, right? Because we cannot be a proper state without a journal dedicated to us, right? So in that magazine, the first thing that they focus on is the very fields in which this university is built on. So it wasn't nothing, it wasn't barren, it wasn't sandy, it was a place where people worked and made food and ate, and I feel deeply strongly about that. So for us to call it a wasteland is to follow in a history that started in England, let's take it place in England, when commons were turned into private estates by doing exactly what we're doing as a nation, is to declare them wastelands or uninhabited lands or empty lands or lands between histories, lands between nalas and railway tracks, right? So I feel that's something we really need to think about. Now, once that was done, it got picked up in India. Right now, if we look anywhere in India, it is the Gomale, the Charaga, the grazing lands which are under attack, as the Kathua rate tells us, right? So let's be really clear at what's at stake here. Let's be really, really clear. Because if we're going to be international, first we have to be human. Okay? So I feel very strongly about this, and thank you for inviting me to say this. And I feel I have to respond because I respect what you said, and I listened to it very, very seriously. So now let me begin by turning your attention to one instance where something was made, where land was not fully built up, but it was occupied, purpose was given to it. It was probably a grazing land, but after 1947, when the city of Bangalore started growing, the city had to expand beyond its medieval boundaries. So a place called Jayanagar was invented. And that place was Asia's largest planned development. It had housing for every category. It had housing for Hindus and Muslims planned into it. It had house forms for LIC employees of class C and D, to large plots of land for growing Brahmin industrialists, and trading community industrialists. So this was the largest planned community in India. So why I bring this to your attention, and I'm going to go through the slides really fast, is because you can build a school to promote a certain kind of thinking. And in my case, I'm engaged with that very complex word called vernacular, which is, as if any of you know that word, it has a kind of awkward history. It was like a word that was in Latin, means the language of the slaves, you know, anything to do with the slaves. But I'm into those kind of words that are messy, and they make us think about power relationships just by the word vernacular, right? So I love those kind of words. So that word is then really useful in thinking about a place, which I'm going to talk about, but that spending 16 years with that place has taught me a lot about how to learn more about the lived experiences of human life in a place called India, and in many places which make up this place called India. So architecture is when I flipped it around, thank you Sarovar for letting me do that, to say when time, memory, fear, and aspiration become visible in space. You could change those words around. You could put other things in there, like money, or you could put in words like corruption. You can put in lots of different kinds of words there, but they all work. So I'll start here. So I'm going to talk about a park in Bangalore, and I think you can see it better than I can on this screen, because for some reason my glasses, I'm not wearing my glasses. Okay, so there are three parks. One is Cubbon Park, which was started in the 19th century by Mark Cubbon. It's one of the most beautiful parks. It's being built up by the minute, full of amazing trees. Bangalore's the middle part of India, so you can grow almost any kind of tree in the world there and then move it anywhere else. Another park I want to bring to your attention is Makkalakuta, which is a children's park that was based on Jawaharlal Nehru's idea of children's parks or children's places called Bal Bhavans. And then the one I'm really focusing is on Lakshman Rao Park, who's a corporator who built this amazing park, which you see in blown up form on the side there. And why I'm showing this to you is within the 16-year period, if you look at the very bottom, which is the south end, you see the BJP Abhay Ganesha temple. It was started along just after the Congress Ganesha temple was started on the left side, on the west side. You'll see on a mosque, you'll see a Ganesh Visarjan tank in an old lake, and then you'll see a badminton court, and I'm going to show you all the pictures, and if you feel like, so this is what the street looked like when it was made. It was designed to look like this on bare land in Mr. Rao's mind. So he wanted all these African rain trees planted, so there was this unbelievable shade on this very wide road, which now holds at the center of its veins the metro. Very soon, this Swayambhu, self-born, autochthonous Ganesha gave Udbhava, or rose up under a tree that was somewhere in 1996 when I started living in the area. And over a period of 20 years, this kind of cage-like temple has emerged. And the park, and the god now, is like dressed in very different kinds of costumes for Google Maps, right? So he's dressed in the abundance of fruit and the abundance of coinage. And the park itself has acquired a children's park. Children are very important because, like all of us who are involved in anything aspirational in India, we focus our energies on the largest demographic in the country, right? So here are the three corporators and the film star Rajkumar at the center. And there are three different kind of things happening. There is the evocation of rural life. So even in the heart of this urban space, we still want the farmer. We still want the village, even if they're the ruling deities or maybe forgotten deities. And then there is the pathway, which is paved for the old people whose children have migrated to the United States, and the kids have told them, here are a pair of Reeboks, Mom and Dad, please exercise because I'm not around to take care of you. And then there is the children's play park, which is completely assembled rapidly out of fiberglass, and it's for play as much as for policing children, right? And then there's the park next to it, which never got developed because it's a Jindal park, and it's the wasteland in that sense, still, the wasteland within the park. It holds it. And that's where the only place where boys get to be something else besides, to use the Turkish phrase, to be something without dogs, to be something more than dogs without collars. So they get to play there, right? And also there is a small made-up gym, Vyayam Shale, and there's a metro that courses above it, kind of creating a new horizon so that the park has a kind of parentheses between the street and the metro. There is the playground that's in front of the mosque, which no party can identify with. And it's built, it's under landscaped, and it's there. And then there's the new personal monument invented by the BJP corporator to the film star Rajkumar, where all of history, it's Rajkumar in every one of his roles, or imaginary roles that he should have played, according to this corporator. So he is as the Mysore King Narasimha Moriyat. This is the opening, and it's using these fiberglass sculptures, new materialities, which you might be interested in, for that pick up the Hoysala kingship's lion symbol. There's the water issues of Karnataka in the river goddess Kaveri pouring out water from her vessel, which actually doesn't have any water. There is this very strange sculpture, which is like a Freudian nothing, or a Freudian something in the middle of the park, of this weird figure drinking something, which I can't really understand. It's a children's park or a history park. Why is he drinking something like that? And this weird bear that's holding a waste bin, and these strange hands that are meant to be benches and are meant to hold buttocks, I think. And there is the attempts to paint the narrative of the ecological city on the walls opposite this park, and the protesters are complaining about the trees being cut every day in our cities. And then there is the badminton stadium that's been built by the corporator to make sure that the idea of recreation is there, but of course it's painted in party colors. And then finally, the representation of time. Here Rajkumar is not a historical king, but he's a suit-wearing person standing next to a clock that is called Ambara Chumbana, the sky-kissing clock tower. So in this sense, all the elements that make up the crazy thing of architecture or built environment or a place called India or a place called Jayanagar in a city like Bangalore are brought here. And this kind of place has made me really think about projects like the Barefoot School of Craft in Goa, and that place that I'm inventing with a bunch of other people, including Dean de Cruz and 8 other architecture students and craftspeople like Shalini Gaude and other kinds of people, is what to do when a place is left. After 1961, many Goans left. And now there are many people moving in temporarily as second homes, or as coming as tourists, or as migrant laborers, or people like me as part of the Serendipity Festival are trying to find our way to what does it mean to be in Goa. And we're kind of working on finding this place. It's not that easy making a place. It requires dedication, it requires attention, and it requires unbelievable humility. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annapurna. That was really fantastic. I would like to invite Rupali to give a small presentation about her work.
Um, so what I'm going to do is, this presentation is in 3 parts, and I'll see, I have, what, 15 minutes? So you can just let me know when it's 15 minutes and I can stop the presentation. Yeah. Okay. No, but what I want to begin with, because this is a new architecture school, and I'm really happy that there is this ambition of making the architecture course. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, I'm too short for this, so I have to step out.
You want to sit here?
No, it's okay. I'll need to move the slides as well.
You can sit here and I'll move it for you.
I would prefer to have the control. I think, yeah, I can do that. I'm standing with this. Just like, acha, yeah. Oh, great, new technology. I can. Okay, so I think one important thing about the program is that what I'm really happy with hearing is that this is a multidisciplinary program, and I think this is something that is super important because I really want to say that both the profession of architecture as well as the pedagogy of architecture today is in crisis, and it's really something that we have to think about. And what I want to do is I want to actually begin with I'll begin with the poster of this. This is the conference that we just had as a kind of the end to this an exhibition that we set up recently called Venice Space: Conversations in Contemporary Architecture. And this was the conference. This was the end, the final day of the conference, where we really wanted to end with this idea of futures. How do we look at the idea of architectural futures? And setting up 4 different ways in which we start looking at futures. We invited various people to think through how we understand the idea of the future of architecture. For example, we understood that the way many things are changing for us. The way we think of drawing has changed. The way we think of institutions today has changed. However, when we think of architectural methodologies and architectural practice, we are still straddled with the same methods that we began with. Architectural education was set up historically in India, and somehow we have the same baggage of the methods that we began with. And I think that is something that we really need to question. The second idea is the question of media. Media is changing up sense perceptions. So what is this new experience that new sense perceptions are bringing in, and what is this new space that we can actually imagine? Again, that is something that is beyond the radar of thinking in both architectural pedagogy and architectural practice. The third, I think, important idea that the conference brought about is that our institutions have changed. Our institutions that we set up, the modern institutions that we set up to think of living, or think of cultural spaces and life, have actually changed. They're in shambles. However, again, architectural practice and pedagogy are really incompetent to kind of deal with these changes. So how do we really, again, work with the debris of these changes and rebuild? And I think the fourth but most important question that the conference brought about was this idea of inclusivity. You know, how do we look at the idea of inclusivity at various levels? And I'm really happy to see that on this panel there's a majority of women, and that's something that is really
that's
striking.
First, by the way, in Delhi. Yeah. To have architecture panel.
Thanks to Sarovar here.
Sorry, sir, you're like the token man of this.
But no, I think really that's something that is very important for us to think about, because when we look at architecture courses in the program itself, you have sometimes more than 70% women. But what happens to the women when they come in, when the profession takes over? there are a handful of women who are actually leading practices. And I think the same goes with, you know, the discipline of architecture and the engagements with society. I think it's only 1% of the population that actually can afford an architect, right? So how do we really look at this, the idea of engagement beyond that 1%? And then what are our methods of working? And I think the third one, which is something that we are really grappling with ourselves in this new, we are a group of architects, 8 of us, who've set up this architecture school. It's not as big as this university. It is a really small, almost like a cooperative, set up by architects putting together our own savings. But this is really a question that one is really working with. There are new students, there are diverse kinds of students who are coming in to study. What are our methods of, what are our pedagogical methods, right? Are those pedagogical methods that we've inherited enough to deal with this diversity? On the other hand, I think what is really interesting is that this is really also a resource for us, right? The diversity is something that can really help to shake up that foundation, that really heavy, almost kind of insipid foundation that we built in both architectural education and practice. How does the diversity come back and help us re-theorize the ideas of architecture in space and really kind of come up with new ways of working? So I think this was the kind of 4 questions that we really began with. And then I want to just show perhaps some experiments in the school. It's probably not enough time to show all of that, but the first experiment that we actually work with is the way we restructure the whole course. So you don't run through 8 or 9 courses that the university has stipulated all at the same time, running between one course and the other, but we treat the course as a series of events. Intensities change. So for example, a course might have the intensity of technological dealings. There might be courses that really work with the idea of spatial questions. There will be a course that really talks about the craft of thinking and making and writing. And so there are intensities, but at one time you're doing just that one thing, and there's a complete mental focus on that. So it's instead of 6 events that you actually take students through. The second very, very important thing, and I think really the first presentation really pointed out to, the engagement with the field. You know, you really cannot think of the field as a tabula rasa. There are serious engagements, occupancies in the field. How do we really look at that? And this is actually a drawing by first year students of a tribal village 2 hours away from Mumbai. And really that's something that changed the way we thought about the idea of home. The idea of home was otherwise this particular square meter space that one actually thought about, but here what really kind of transpired was that the home was just not that one space, but it was the forest, it was the settlement, it was the river, and all of those relationships that actually formed the home. And of course there was also the relationship of the temporariness of the home. So for example, the house was actually something that was built every 2 years. It disintegrated and was built as a part of a cyclical kind of process. And that is something that the government just did not recognize. So there was, for example, the Indira Awas Yojana here, which said that, only when you have permanent houses, only when you're building in brick and mortar, that's when we'll give you the funds. So the tribals were actually very clever. So they actually took the funds, they used the money to repair their houses, which was illegal. But then they would build a little shed outside to show that the funds were actually used for that. So in some ways, what is interesting is that the ground community is not something that is, sterile. It's not something that is without agency. There are people who are constantly working on the ground. How does the architect actually engage with that process on the ground? And that is something. And the other really important thing that this study also brought about was that we found ourselves not going back with an anthropological gaze on the society, but the anthropological gaze actually turned back onto ourselves. Really, for us, it was about how do we actually live our lives, right? How does one learn from things around rather than this idea of seeing the other through the gaze of the outsider? So many lessons learned, and then there are a series of engagements that, for example, this is an archaeologist working with the students. This is the way you start a history theory course, where you actually look, this is the Canary Caves, we're very close to the school, but you begin not with the fact-finding method of talking about history, but starting to look at material processes and how you actually decipher. Yeah? How is it possible to actually speculate certain kinds of methods of living through material processes? And that's really how you begin a history theory course. And then of course there's engagements with geography, with terrain, with energy, water. So you don't call them services or water supply, but you really look at the idea of energy and water and air. And then there are questions of type and typology. How do you look at idea of existing typologies which are embedded in certain cultural processes, and how do you then kind of build with these ideas of type? This is another important question that students deal with, and we call them ontological questions or ontological inquiries, where you don't begin with building a school. You're not given a project of building a school, but we ask the question, what is a school? Each of the students are actually engaged with kind of talking or thinking through the process of thinking of what a school is. So for example, this one is what is a home. So there was what is a school, what is a home, and just last year we looked at what is an archive. And so the students actually deal with these questions through the engagements on the field, engagements through texts, but also engagements through their own kind of processes of writing. And this was actually an installation that they made as the part of the design process, which they took to Kochi at the Kochi Students' Biennale. And then there's their teaching through making, and that's what the extended time allows you to, because you're not moving to another subject at the same time. What you do is you can spend an entire day out on the field or an entire week out in the field. And then other engagements is they were making playgrounds in a nearby school. And then this idea of the extended classroom, right? You're not really only working with the classroom within, but you invite the world to your classroom. So every fortnightly we have talks, which are public talks, and all kinds of engagements. This is something that we do every Friday, where students engage with what we call this the assembly, where the entire school comes together and discuss one particular contemporary issue, starting, it could be from the coastal road to black magic to demonetization, and that's something that the entire school discusses together. And then I think the last, I think I'm going to end here with the school's experiments, that one very important thing is to bring new knowledge. How do you give students the confidence of building new knowledge? This was part of a course where the students actually looked at modern architecture in Mumbai, and at the end of the course where they were writing, they were drawing, and they were studying these buildings, they put together a poster which is now circulating in the city. So the idea is again that there is a kind of dissemination, circulation of knowledge that goes back into the city and comes out of the classroom. So again, this whole idea of an extended classroom, which is beyond the pedagogical space of the studio. And okay, so what I'll do is, okay, maybe I'll just skip to just kind of touching a little bit on our own work, because that's an extension of the way we think of pedagogy in the school, and the whole idea of the expanded idea of architectural practice. That again, the idea of the figure of the architect really does not only have to be in the realm of making buildings. Even in the realm of making buildings, there are various ways in which you can engage. I'll just very quickly touch on this. I'm not talking about what this project is, but this is something that we were invited by Audi Urban Future Initiatives to talk about mobility mobility in the city of Mumbai. And then what we said is that mobility is not transportation, okay? And the future, when it's a future of mobility, it's a future is not one. It cannot be one because there are multiple agencies which are operating, and so there are multiple futures. So what we did then is that we kind of mapped these speculations and multiple futures, and we said what we do is simply make tools for people to engage with these multiple futures. And so that was the kind of process of working. So I'm not going to, these were the tools. And okay, I'll just talk about this one last because Sarovar wanted me to. And this was This is basically the whole kind of theorization of cities, which we say have transactional capacities. Cities have transactional capacities. So for example, if you look at a plan where there's only one line on the map, it's actually not a single line. Just like you were saying, there are various occupancies. And you see these 4 layers of occupancies. And cities throw up these transactional spaces and transactional capacities to actually intervene or negotiate ways of living. And so, let me just, so these are very, so for example, just to give you one example, this is a chawl space, which is a very, very tiny space. And the doors are never kept closed, they're always open. This particular thing is that transactional object, which closes at the same time the door of the cabinet and then the door of the space outside. So it's the same thing that is closing both, because it's not necessary to close both at the same time all the time. So what we did, okay, I'm just going to skip all of this. So what we basically kind of looked at was to work with these transactional spaces and talk about the idea of future. How do we look at the idea of future, which is not a utopian future out there, but one step ahead of the existing transactional spaces. And then we built, and this was actually for a project at the Venice Biennale, where the proposition to the world was that the future is not something out there, but one step ahead of the existing transactional spaces. So for example, this is the day and night 1 foot shop. Okay, this is the 1 foot shop, which is only 1 foot wide, and that is something that forms property in cities. It forms property only by simple occupation. And in the night, when that shop closes, the shutter is something that occupies another space. So there's a day and night 1 foot shop that happens. So yeah, I mean, there's a series of spaces. This is, okay, let me just end with this one. That this is this one space, which is a shop, and if you find that little stick, it touches the city only at one point. Yeah? And by touching the city at one point, it occupies very little space. So what we did is actually we did this. We built this pokey sphere, which touches the city at 3 points and can be rolled away in times of rains. So I'm going to just end there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Vipali. That was a really interesting presentation, and I know there are going to be lots of interesting questions, but since we're short on time, I invite Professor A.G.K. Menon to give his thoughts and comments.
Thank you for inviting me here, and thank you for making me participate in this new venture of starting a new College of Architecture. What I have to say is not prepared, because I find that my colleagues had something to say. I have nothing to say. I have only myself to present, and I'll just talk about a few things that perhaps that I've done as my presentation. The first thought that occurs to me is that much of what is being said now has been said 30 years ago. When we were starting our new school, we said exactly the same things. Same words, same ideas, same intent was articulated in starting a new College of Architecture then. In fact, then we didn't even call it a School of Architecture, because we realized that in a country like India, architecture made no sense. So we called it the School of Habitat Studies. So the whole idea was it was a school of studies in which the teacher and the student studied, and one heard that earlier in earlier presentations. So I have a feeling of deja vu when I listen that through all these presentations, it's all been said before, and we're saying it again, and maybe 30 years from now your students will say the same thing again. That makes me ask the first question: where are we going and what are we doing? In a country like India, if you're going to keep on reinventing the wheel, what is the what is our strategy? What's the game plan? So if I might pose it to the Jindal school, if you're reinventing the wheel, what have you achieved? What will you achieve? If 30 years from now, another Jindal school comes up and says the same thing, saying that, oh, we've got to reinvent the world, you know, things didn't work, architecture didn't work, you know, our country's in a mess, everything's in a mess, we need a new School of Architecture, and we need to start all over again. So the point I'm making is that why do we always start all over again? Why can't we continue what has already been done and maybe take it further? Why is it that all of us are geniuses and earlier there were no geniuses, and from now on no genius is going to come and we are the only ones who matter? So can we think about that? So can the School of Architecture, the Jindal School of Architecture, dwell on it? Can it think of a pedagogy that is not inventive but progressive, progresses from what has already been done? What I heard today was, it all seems to be that we have discovered it and now we're going to be practicing it. And so it's going to be New India now, because the Jindal School of Architecture is going to give you that. So I would just like to sort of say, can we please look at what has happened? And one model I can put is that, and I'm glad to see that Jaydeep is here, he knows the model very well.
That's probably why you heard some of those things.
That can we take it forward? What went wrong? Why was it that in presenting these ideas we found resistance? Why were we stopped from progressing further? Is it because we didn't have the money? Is it that we didn't have the right ideas? Is it right because we didn't have the right, it wasn't the right moment? Whatever. So I would like to sort of, listening to all this, I was just wondering, well, what went wrong with our experiment? I repeat, it's the same experiment that you are embarking on. Same words, same everything, same intent, same everything. What went wrong? Why did it fail? Or indeed, I would like to say, if I might use my own metaphor, it has not failed. It continues here in Jindal. It continues maybe in future Jindals. So maybe that's what it is, that our burden as India, as a third world country, is to constantly reinvent ourselves. It becomes a burden that we've got to constantly measure ourselves against someone else. Measure ourselves against what happened in the West. Measure ourselves against development. Measure ourselves against modernity. Measure ourselves against all these things. Can we please not measure ourselves against anyone, but start doing things what we need to do? A couple of weeks ago I was at a conference, and it made me think that this conference was on building for a billion. And it makes you think that we as architects in 70 years have not been able to house our people. Now in 1947, 48, 49, when India and China both got free, we were in about the same situation. 4 countries, populous countries, homeless countries. In 30 years, 40 years, China claims, it's a fake truth, I don't know, claims that it has housed all its people. India still says that we got, it was 10 years ago, 10 million homeless, now we are seeing 17 million homeless, tomorrow we'll say 24 million homeless. Our homeless numbers increase. What is the profession of architecture doing? What have we achieved in 70 years? With all our experiments, with all our ideas. If our society remains homeless, what is the point of schools of architecture? Who are we addressing our pedagogy to? Is it only to compare ourselves to another model in the West or wherever, saying that, oh, we are also can produce great architecture? Is that the purpose of schools of architecture? Are all these studio-centered education we're going to talk about going to be compared to Harvard and Yale? Or are you going to compare us to the fact that we'll house our million people? Will that be the model that you will be able to address? So I am a bit, as I said, sorry I didn't have a presentation. I have a bit of like, Annapurna here became a bit angry listening to all this. Firstly, because I've heard all this before and I'm hearing it again. And why am I being called to talk about the same things? So that is one. And the second is, can we please look at our profession with the objective that it's supposed to achieve, which is make a decent humane society. Not these fantastic buildings, fantastic architecture, fantastic ideas. Can we please think of our humane environment? And of course, we've used magic words like sustainability and all that. That's fine, and I think all that's required. Climate change, of course, that's required. All that is required. All that is very much there. In fact, the other day I was at Dinesh Mohan's another symposium where we said that we got all these transport plans, but we got the most fantastic transport plan. It is almost carbon neutral. We walk, we bicycle. In fact, the statistics showed that over 50% of the people in India walk or cycle to work. What could be better? What could be better? And yet we're getting all these plans to say that we've got to change things. Change to what? To introduce cars. And I think someone mentioned that buses are also polluting. They're also, they've got problems. So can we then think of the paradigm in which our cities, we can bicycle and walk to work? And not have these fantastic cities that are Singapore or Shanghai or smart. And because we have many things already sorted out, it's just that we are throwing it away. For what? I don't know. But we're just throwing it away. And similarly, it happens with all professions. It happens with architecture, it happens with urban planning. And in the last few years, I've been involved in conservation, and I find that in conservation also, we had for 1,000 years a wonderful conservation practice, how we looked after our monuments. Now we suddenly want UNESCO and ECOMOS to tell us how to conserve our buildings. Which is, in what way? What happens to the way we were conserving our buildings anyway? Why is it that we can't look at it, why can't our schools of architecture teach those things? And when the TVB started, all these things were put together. Because we had sustainability experts, we had vernacular architecture experts, we had conservation experts. We all got together and said, let's have a school of habitat studies. Because we're going to make a better habitat, and let's get all these disciplines together and make a better habitat. And teach in that way. So that's basically what I had to say. I had no presentation, but I'm a bit wary of another new school coming. I think you said 300. The figures I heard was on nearly 500. So what are these 500 schools doing? So I just end up with one thing that I'm doing, and I've stopped teaching. I've stopped doing a lot of these things. So, but I'm still involved in teaching. And one of the projects we are working on is in Goa, as a matter of fact, in the Goa College of Architecture, where I go because I have a second home, and I go there, and they wrote me into the college, and I go there. And I was asked to look at the thesis, and I said, my God, here's a thesis of all these bright students, irrelevant. What are you trying to design? What are you trying to produce? So they said, well, what can you do? So here I've got a new project in Goa that can I motivate the students to look at architecture differently. So there starts the story once again. Thank you.
I would now like to invite Anuradha Iyer Siddiqui to give a short presentation on her work.
Is it on? Does it work?
Thanks to the other presenters also sitting at the table with me and to the audience. Thank you for this invitation to be here. So, I am incredibly jet lagged. I'm maybe the farthest traveled person at the table, and I walked in and was immediately accosted by a young man taking film footage for Jindal University, asking the speakers to talk about why, or speak to 12th standard students and talk about why they should become architects. And I stared at him with probably very wild, bloodshot eyes, and all I could think was, why the hell would anyone want to be an architect? So I did not say that in the live stream. But I've been happily reminded that for every time there are architects and patrons, there will be people like the ones at this table who will look at them in the face and tell them very clearly what they are doing and what the ethics and politics are of what they are doing. So, I always open up all my discussions of my own work by acknowledging my collaborators, and I would like to really acknowledge the insights, patience, and humor of many refugees and many aid workers who made it possible for me to do my work. I think today I also need to acknowledge many displaced farmers in Haryana who are making it possible for me to sit here right now. So, I started thinking about when architecture happens, as Sarovar asked me to. And I'm a historian of architecture, and I think I use architecture and its various forms to look very closely at the modern and at modernity. Modernity has occasioned anti-social and misanthropic architectures, like the architectures of colonialism or capitalism. It's also occasioned the humanistic and social projects of architecture. So these things may seem very different from one another, but I want to sort of point out the ways in which they're very similar. They flatten difference. They attempt to homogenize. They disallow solidarities that might be predicated precisely upon difference. And I think difference might be a very good thing for us to think about today. So, I have been thinking for a long time about feminism as the recuperation of difference. Feminism is a kind of lens upon power. It's sometimes, but not always, related to gender. But I've been working on feminist approaches to history. And I think those kinds of approaches seek to overturn power structures in the narration of history. And they do this in many ways, sometimes very strident ways, but I'm very interested in doing these through radical forms of care, conviviality, and collaboration. I don't use these three terms lightly. I think they mean something very radical. So, using care, conviviality, and collaboration, I think we can write histories of architecture and histories of modernity that use architectures to write with the people to whom architecture has done violence. And I say with also very specifically. Instead of writing histories to them or for them, the way that patriarchal histories are, or simply writing histories at them or about them, the way that colonial histories do. With radical forms of care and conviviality and collaboration in mind, history writing doesn't become a mechanism for othering people, but instead for togethering people. So I think as you're thinking about how to put together a university, how to put together an architecture school and what it should do, you should really think about that business of togethering. There are lots of ways to be a slave, and money makes great slaves. These are also feminist ideas, and I've turned to a few different feminists as I've thought of this, because I've thought a lot about how to put together concepts of care and also concepts of creative power, which I think are really fundamental to architecture schools. So for this, I have also thought about migration as a feminist historical method. The lens of migration makes differences sensible. It allows them to be seen, it allows them to be touched. And I think some of the work that we've already seen today has already really demonstrated that very well. I believe the analytic of migration offers the opportunity to pose two arguments. First, that the dynamic of a situated and resituated perspective is foundational to feminist histories of architecture. And second, that it performs the indispensable work of destabilizing presumptions of and desires for fixity at the heart of the discipline of architecture. So I've been working on these theorizations in two subject areas. And again, I would say that in those two areas, I've engaged in radical forms of care, conviviality, and collaboration. They're represented in these two images. One is a history of architectural and a kind of architecture and territorial history of colonialism and humanitarianism in East Africa. It draws in part from research into the work of forced migrants as commissioners, designers, and fabricators of built environments, engendered practices in emergency camps. And the camp I have focused on is the largest one in the world, administered by the UNHCR. It's near a small village called Dadaab in East Africa, in Kenya, on the border of Somalia. The other project is on modernist cultural production in Imperial South Asia. It builds on research into the career of Minette de Silva, here on the right. She initiated a migratory architectural practice in the early 1940s, and as Annapurna mentioned, she was one of the founders of MARD. The histories of these perhaps disparate sounding projects overlap, but their link for me is in their feminist historical method. So, I want to talk about histories of migration and mobility in two different streams, and the first is a stream that really involves a group of women through the late 19th to the early 20th century as a way of really thinking about teaching histories of architecture in schools of architecture. These are women whose work was transnationally mobile, they were cosmopolitan, they were known and named figures of modernism. And due to their travels, they tended to have a repeated focus on the vernacular, the folkloric, the everyday, and the anonymous. This is a very long but incomplete list of transnational practices across continents. And the women on this list cross borders of race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, ideology, within empire as well as post-colonial territory. And their migrations turned a lens on culture. They posited architecture not as exceptional, but as entangled with many other forms of cultural production. Design, arts and crafts, curating, planning, structuring, building, historicizing, teaching, thinking, throwing dinner parties. So, these include Greta Schulte-Lehotsky's kindergartens, Sybil Molinaj's grain silo, Nina Bovardi's Bahia, Minette de Silva's artisan, Denise Scott Brown's Las Vegas, Anna Schreckenbach's mud architecture in Ghana, and Flora Rushat-Roncati's dining table. The theory behind the theory that connects these women is that each of their practices stemmed from the view of a stranger. So that's one category of work that I've been looking at. The other category is empowering links between mobility and architecture that come from narratives of and by migrants, whose designs, built forms, and constructed environments have not actually been understood as authored, or of anonymous objects that have been illegible within the frameworks of modern architectural history. If you look at this site, which you might not guess from a Google satellite map is actually a refugee camp, because it looks much more like an actual city, you see a kind of authority that might be embodied by migratory works. These things may have lacked signature, but not significance. and they pose a challenge to the architectural discipline's purported stabilities. They create or unsettle architectural discursivity and enact other kinds of forms of power. These are predicated upon migration and mobility. They're also predicated on their mirrors, restriction and confinement. So I'm interested in thinking about the different forms, the forms of difference that are suggested by these two different categories, and in thinking about radical forms of care, of togethering, of how to think with subjects like these on the screen. It seems important to link these two, the named and the unnamed, the known and the unknown, the authors and the anonymous, the objet d'art or the designed work, and the merely made or built, and to irrevocably entangle them, so that each serves the other, constructs new forms of authority, legitimacy, and meaning. You can have a Jindal University and you can have displaced farmers, and they need not be in opposition. They can be in dialogue. So I'm just going to quickly go through some of the content of two of my areas of research, because I think it's been helpful to see some of the really rich content of what people have been working on. And I'll go very quickly just so we have more things to refer to. This is the architect Minette de Silva in the year before her death. She was born in 1918, died in 1998. She was a force as well as a hidden figure in histories of modernism in the state. And I was thinking so much about this question of when is architecture. And I was thinking that Minette is a really fantastic example of how to revise historical narratives of when was architecture for modernism. In South Asia broadly, but in India specifically. So very specifically in India, this is Minette in 1941 in Cuff Parade in Bombay. She's in front of her rented apartment in a building known in today's landmark building register as Tara Porivala Mansion. Some of you probably know this building. For decades, it was the home of Mulkraj Anand. He was the novelist and chief editor of Marg. And in spite of the destruction and redevelopment of much of the building fabric in this neighborhood, the facade of Tara Porivala Mansion has been preserved, and its value was in part attached to Mulkraj Anand's legacy. Marg was born in this building, in this house, and years later, when he himself was in an administrative role in the arts in India's new government, Mulkraj Anand's discussion with Prime Minister Nehru and the architect Le Corbusier would contribute to the former, inviting the latter to plan the new town of Chandigarh and design the capital complex. But before that, in 1947, as a young architect, having just completed her studies at the Architectural Association in London, Minette de Silva attended the post-war reunion meeting of the International Congress of Modern Architecture as a representative of Marg, where she met Le Corbusier and initiated a friendship that would last to the end of his life. This may have paved the way for those governmental discussions. And I think neither the significance of the Chandigarh Commission for Le Corbusier, for India, for 20th century culture and politics, and frankly for the history of all architecture in cities can be overstated, nor the cultural impact of Marg. And de Silva's extraordinary biography is the site of many of these kinds of significant but hidden intersections. And I think if we follow her trail, we find a very different set of histories that look very different from the ones we tell. So just want to flip quickly through some of her work so you can see some of the buildings that she designed. She was very concerned with architecture, ecology, arts and crafts as decoration, reviving textile production. Again, and this is the way that she wrote her memoir, much as an archive. She was really interested in archiving and all of these other forms as multiple forms of cultural production, not just as architecture as we know it. The second category, and again I'll move very quickly through some slides. I have spent 8 years of research in archives and working with refugees and aid workers in camps in East Africa and in South Asia. I conducted approximately 300 interviews with individuals and groups of refugees, aid workers, officials, and architects on a project that really, a book project on architecture and humanitarianism. These camps, again, are on the border of Somalia. And I've attempted to really think of this space and its architecture not only as carceral, which is the way that it is often depicted, but also to see it as figured very vitally by women, whom I think of as architects, such as these women who were designing a restaurant in camps, this woman who designed her own home and her shop, this woman who I met only hours after she arrived at the camps. She's carrying on her back the only 8 items she had, and she was about to go to the periphery of the camp to build her own space. So this space that you saw, the aerial view above, is really made by the buildings that these women themselves built. And I just end with this image of a political leader in these camps. Human beings participate in history, Michel Rolfe-Trouillot writes, both as actors and narrators. And I'd like to argue that each of these women turned from the position of aid recipient to viewing subject, and that this transformation was akin to the shift from historical protagonist to narrator of history. The production of a viewing subject is linked to the production of political subjectivity and political speech. And here a form of speech came from the making of an architecture. So I hope you'll also think about that. All of these women, from Minette de Silva to Ismina Ali Raga, were migrants, and writing their histories has required migratory methods. And this preoccupation with migration is a strategy to substantiate new narratives, a kind of way to rethink when architecture happens. I think of these as feminist approaches to architectural histories of migration, and these architectures of migration as feminist approaches. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anuradha. That was really, really interesting, and especially shifting the idea of who is an architect and who is not, and who we declassify from the ideas of architecture in built form. I invite Dr. Yasmin Arif to present her thoughts. Thank you.
Is this fine? Well, the first thing I have to say is that I'm not an architect and I'm not angry. At this point, I have been, I'm an academic whose my profession demands that I go to several conferences, and I've been doing a bit of that in recent times. What I'm seeing is a lot of despair, a bit of the despair that we've heard today as well. The only thing that I would add to that is that despair is all right, but I think we also need hope. We also need a politics of hope. And it is in that spirit that I'd certainly like to congratulate this new school. I thank Sarovar and Jay for including me here. I come from a university, I teach in Delhi University, and I think our universities are being stifled, and I'm looking for new classrooms, and I'm congratulating you for opening up new spaces. Your intents may be old, but I hope your hope is new. And that is what I welcome the school for. The second thing, a little about me, quite an introduction was provided by Sarovar, but just to take Professor Mikha's words, I continue to be a T-shaped student. I have lived and learned sociology, social anthropology, and many other things in my last 20 years of living in Delhi. I think my T-bar, I'm still skating, and I hope when I reach the end of my life, I'll somewhere have global as my middle name. I'm entirely made in India. I have nothing to show as far as pictures are concerned. I'm hoping that once you step out of this room into the city of Delhi, you will see what I'm hoping to talk about. Anyway, as I said, I'm a sociologist, and my first research commitment has been in cities, which I assume where architects spend some of their time in. I began with the rebuilding of Beirut after the wars in Lebanon, and I have continued to work with unstable living in very fragile environments. A lot of what I have done in the urban has led me to revisit the idea of life and pose it as epistemology, as method, as politics, and as ethics in the understanding of the social. I hope to use my brief 10 minutes, do stop me when I should, today to respond to your questions from that approach. So your inaugural question is a very profound and grand one. When is architecture? If you've looked at the poster, that's what it asks. So let me try a bit of creative etymology here with the word architecture. Architecture is what the architect does, as all of us have heard today, and the word architect comes from the Greek architekton, and I do not apologize for borrowing from roots in Western thought. An architect means a chief builder or principal craftsman. That comes from the English or French arch as in high, that is the master as one half of the word, to tectus or builder, the other half of the word. Architect thus is the master builder. I prefer the interpretation principal craftsman. And leading from that idea, I'm going to take some liberties here and say that tectus is not too far from techne, the craft, or some would say the art of technique. And techne, more importantly for me, is also implied in the matter of rhetoric, a matter of communication, a matter of persuasion. So with this largely creative etymology, could we suggest that architecture is the techne by which the architect practices her art of communication and convincing, perhaps even persuasion, with the craft of building? As we often say, the built environment is the language that architecture speaks. That is why, as we have heard, we even have vernacular architecture. But that is a matter of another discussion. But what does architecture speak about? What does it persuade and communicate? In my reading, architecture communicates, convinces, and persuades social life. That might not be anything new for any one of us here, but yet it is an eternal condition of human life that needs constant excavation in how, what, and where, and of course when. When you ask when is architecture, I would respond that architecture is when it communicates and even persuades social life. It is a techne of the social. This is where I connect to your second thematic. You've also, in that beautifully crafted poster, there's also the word affect. Let me try and elaborate on this connection with an architectural aid, the blueprint, a lot of which we saw with the brilliant architect for the Jindal School. For architects and planners, these are the maps and the plans that will shape the buildings as well as the environments that those buildings will inhabit. They are the representations of their imagination, their technique, their craft, and most times their power. The blueprint, I would say, holds the power to make a social and the life that will inhabit it, and conversely, the absence of a blueprint is the lack of power, the inability to plan or map a building. Between these two bookends lies the entire archive of planning, proposing, imagining, and improvising what can and will be built, and one must not and cannot be a blueprint. And from these archives emerge those craftsmen and women who respond to this power of the blueprint and make it a craft of their own. This is what I've seen, I think, in most of the presentations today. These are the women who make refugee camps their homes. These are the young ones who are building our fantastic schools. And this is, like I said, refugee camps become cities, pavements become homes. Sustainable or earthquake-resistant homes get designed, or movements like Homes for Humanity begin. While I question the necessity of camps or the persistence of poverty, or celebrate the empathy or consume the aesthetic, I must acknowledge the labor, the craft, the technique, the life that is built in responding to the power of blueprints. These archives and their actors hold the past of the social, predicts a future, and emerges always in the contemporary. Allow me now to think of this blueprint as a metaphor of a contouring, of a forming for the shape of life and the shape of social. I'm riffing a little bit on Hollywood movies right now. The arrangement of life in the built environment, in offices or clubs, in shanties or skyscrapers, in roads or highways and flyways, in prisons, in detention centers, in camps, in schools and universities, is the arrangement or shape of the social. These arrangements are those that expose our emotions to the social, literally socialize affect into emotion. They bring into close proximity the emotions of living with the environment of living, what we feel about where we live, how we move, how we stay still, how we work, how we sleep. These are the arrangements that communicate, convince, and persuade the emotions that accompany freedom or subjugation, liberty or constraint, suffering or celebration, absence or presence. In effect, the arrangement of life in built space is that which preempts and persuades the power of the social in shaping life. In where we live, how we live, with whom, and of course when. Ultimately, it is both the actual and metaphorical blueprint, one that emerges from power or one that responds to it, that persuades recognition of what life is. That is the sense in which, as I said, architecture is the principal technique, the master builder of life and the social. Let me end with a few small anecdotes. Any advertisement today for any latest high-end residential property in Gurgaon, or as it is called, Gurugram, usually promises the possibility of a 180-degree view of the horizon through toughened glass windows that stretch from floor to ceiling of an apartment that covers the whole floor of the building. A home, perhaps more than a century old in Old Delhi, promises a view of the sky from a window on the floor, which is also someone's roof, through which a gaze can travel from the floor to the sky but cannot see a horizon. What shares the blueprint here? The floors, skies, glass, horizons, and homes. And what separates the blueprints? The emotions of proximity and distance, the economies of density and sparseness of family life and social life. Another anecdote. I was recently walking in Berlin, where in places on the pavement, a small plaque announces the name of a Jewish person who had lived close by and who had been deported to a camp. The many analytics of urban memory, of the politics of commemorative architecture, explains that plaque in many theories of urban social architecture. I certainly understood social responsibility of memory in that city, which could make each life, each step, touching that plaque under one's foot become the sign of one of humanity's greatest follies. I could not, though, find an answer to whose names will lie below our feet in Delhi. Nor do I know if there are pavements in the occupied territories of Gaza. How is life or the social without the blueprint? Or when is that architecture? As I started with etymology, I think I'll end with one as well. This is something from an author I admire, Richard Casey. He talks about the Greek word perikon. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. It means container, literally a having or holding around. To be in place is to be sheltered and sustained by its containing. It is to be held within this boundary rather than to be dispersed by an expanding horizon of time or to be exposed indifferently in space. To end again with an answer to your question, I imagine the reply to when is architecture is when we capture time in the space of life's blueprint. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin. That was really great. I now invite Thomas Michael to say, well, he's agreed to say exactly 3 sentences, as you, and then I will conclude this session.
I think because of the richness of the presentations, trying to do a simple response would in many ways undermine what has been the valuable contribution of a lot of lifelong and career-long studies. So I'm just going to offer a couple of quick snapshots and then maybe defer to Sarovar to parse a little more some of the nuance. We were discussing when I met some of the staff yesterday the difference between pedagogy and curriculum, and particularly the idea that within a healthy pedagogy, the curriculum can transform, but often the curriculum becomes this codification system or morsalization. And the real valuable parts of the pedagogy are the focal points or the subject positions are being articulated. And I come from a model where we expect a pedagogy or curriculum to follow a model based on dissent and critique, not homogenization or unification. Perhaps not in a dialectical mode, but sometimes, I guess, in the optimistic, heuristic mode as well. And I think just listening through the presentations here at one level, trying to follow the nuances, but also trying to tease out the value system, I think there's actually a lot of rich material that we could start to unpack and a lot of resonances that I saw. But I just wanted to say also, I remember the first time I was teaching, I was really offended to have one of my lectures canceled because we had a visiting architect come. And the dean, I was there in tears, and the dean explained to me, he said, look, this is a lecture you probably spent a week preparing. This person spent their whole life preparing that hour. It's time for you to defer to that expertise.
Thank you. I think there's very little time for responses, but I do want to conclude this session, and I want to conclude it with a reminder that a lot of you have tried to put forward in all your presentations. And I think there is this quote of Gabriel Garcia Marquez which comes to mind, which is the incessant pressure of freedom as the absent horizon, and how built environments and schools of architecture are a negotiation with this freedom and to move towards horizons that may or may not be achieved. And with this doubt and with the hope that we may be able to achieve some of this, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I think we're very late for dinner, but before dinner we also need to thank all of you. So I invite Professor Vyasa to the stage for thanking all of you. Thank you.
Good evening. A few weeks back, the Vice Dean of the School of Architecture came to me along with his colleagues, and I had a chance to see this draft schedule. And when I saw the title of this, like when is architecture, I said, are you sure about the topic? Shouldn't it be like, what is architecture? And so he explained to me, and then I grudgingly accepted what he said. But today, after this fascinating panel, I'm really convinced about the theme that has been chosen. And thank you very much. I want to thank each of the panelists for their excellent perspectives. And we are a multidisciplinary university. We have 6 schools up and running, several taught programs, and we are so delighted that Jindal School of Art and Architecture will be our 7th school, adding to the truly interdisciplinary studies where different disciplines enrich each other and contribute to the academic excellence and progress. And we are so delighted at this launch of this newest school. And we hope in the times to come, in the words of Jaideep, that it will surely become a center of foremost learning and in the about the built environment, making and thinking and talking about this built environment. And to echo Stefan Baumier, the architect who built our university, and he, as a tribute to his own profession, kept it above the law school. And I hope in the years to come, the school through and its faculty and students' achievements will go a great deal and cover itself with a lot of glory. And I have several persons to thank for the successful conduct of this function. The first and foremost, the Dean Designate Thomas Michael, and also the Vice Dean Dr. Jaideep Chatterjee, Alok Panna, Sarovar Jaiti, and Mr. Girish, Yester, and other colleagues from the Jindal School of Art and Architecture who are present here today. And also I want to thank our events team and also the admission team who are present here, who have helped in the successful organization of this. I also want to thank all the distinguished guests from outside our university who have come and who are participating in this event. I also want to thank my own colleagues from JGU who are attending this event.